Welcome to the Singapore Management University podcast series, where we feature the latest insights and perspectives from our faculty. Modern market economies make extensive use of economic and financial forecasts at all levels, from guiding government policy and business decisions to the choices made by individual consumers, savers, and investors. Forecasting is a particularly valuable tool for governments and monetary authorities as they formulate policies and strategies for the future. Professor Peter Phillips is Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale University and Distinguished Term Professor of Economics, Keppel Professor of Financial Economics at the Singapore Management University. His research covers many areas of econometrics, its empirical applications, and its wider implementations in fields such as communications and environmental science. His latest empirical work includes an econometric analysis of the recent financial and sovereign debt crises, which has led to the development of a new warning alert system for financial market exuberance. Professor Phillips believes that crowd wisdom has a big part to play in economic forecasting, that is, the collective opinion of groups of individuals may be more accurate than the best informed individual or a single economic forecasting model. In this podcast, he shares his insights about crowd wisdom and discusses other key indicators that may point to economic instability in the future. Professor, what role does crowd wisdom play in economic forecasting?
Yes, I use this term crowd wisdom to represent the fact that we source information from many different areas in economics and finance rather than narrowly focus on the use of a particular model or a particular data set. There's some very good reasons for this, the primary one being that all models that we use are wrong. They're only approximations to reality. They hopefully contain some kernel of truth. Each model has its own kernel of truth, and if we can find some way of extracting that kernel of truth in a meaningful way by combining information across models, then it's very helpful to us. This idea really goes back to some fundamental original thinking by Francis Galton, who, amongst many other things, was involved in discovering the importance of hereditary and regression to the mean, which is what we all learn about in elementary biology.
Coming back to you saying that all models are wrong, why do you say that?
Models are just stylized representations of a real-world process. Inevitably, they will be wrong because there are so many interdependent aspects of economic, social, financial activity. And, of course, the world is forever changing. And so it's very difficult to capture these multifarious aspects of reality into a single structural or reduced form model. And because of the fact that we have to address this high level of complexity, then it's simpler in a very high dimensional framework, which is what we're now working in these days with the big data issues that we have before us, is to find simple ways of combining the information that's contained in various dimensions of the data in a productive and constructive way.
In economic forecasting, is there a key indicator that points to financial crisis in the future?
Well, the history of financial booms and busts shows that human beings typically create these, something at the rate of 3 or 4 per generation. And given the fact that this has been historically the case for some 400 or 500 years now, and in virtually all of these cases, no one has succeeded in successfully predicting them. So our chances of doing so in the future are similarly rather limited. However, if we look at the global financial crisis of 2008, for example, although most economists and people working in the financial industry had very little idea of the impending crisis and the extent of the impact on the real sector of the crisis. There were some individuals who raised alarm. One of my colleagues at Yale, Robert Shiller, pointed to house price inflation as a major issue. And there were, of course, new financial derivatives that some people were concerned about. But there were other people who were making very systematic use of them, and in particular the use of credit default swaps for mortgage-based backed securities was a strong leading indicator that didn't really appear in anyone's thinking except those who were taking advantage of them. So there were certain knowledgeable individuals who were aware of the impending crisis in 2006, 2007.
Would you say that a build-up in credit can also be an important indicator of impending financial stability in an economy?
Yes, it's certainly true that excessive credit creation is one of the major indicators of some financial instability. Debt is like a drug. When we take a little bit of it, then it can be very stimulating. It enables us to go out and buy a whole lot of things that we're unable to buy. When debt becomes a much larger percentage of our overall financial situation, then it can become very risky. And this is something that economists have recognized for a long time. Well, cash flow is always an issue. I mean, we see this with the situation that developed post-crisis in Europe. Cash flow in the case of sovereign debt, the fact that people really weren't able to meet their commitments, and the peripheral European countries were very much in that situation and had great difficulty and required a bailout in order to survive. Once again, some people were making very substantial money on credit default swaps against Greek debt.
Is there a certain tipping point or trigger point that indicates an impending financial crisis? For instance, a certain debt to GDP ratio?
Well, economists often say 100% because if you have a 100% debt GDP ratio, then in order to run down the debt, you have to be growing the economy at something like 4 or 5% a year, and most advanced economies aren't growing at anywhere near that rate, and so this is seen to be a critical level.
On that note, we understand that Japan's debt to GDP ratio is way beyond 100%. Is that a worrying statistic for the world economy?
Yes, Japan has a rather extraordinary debt to GDP ratio. It's certainly around 200%, and most of that debt is held by people in Japan, and they're prepared not to call in the debt. But when the debt is held by other countries, then they may call it in, and that's where the risks lie.
Thank you, Professor.